Thank you for tuning into this presentation on the Harvest Control Rule Draft Addenda and Framework. My name is Dustin Colson-Leaning, and I am a Fishery Management Plan Coordinator for the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission that is working on this action. This is a recording of a presentation that will be given at the public hearings associated with this action. A link to the draft addenda and a quick reference guide can be found in the description of this video. This presentation will cover background information on this action's purpose, an overview of the specifications process, an introduction to the 5 Harvest Control Rule options, and a brief overview of some of the management options, such as selection of a target metric for setting measures, options on the Commission's conservation equivalency policy, and accountability measures. The presentation will conclude with information on how to submit written comments. Summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish are jointly managed by the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council in federal waters and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission in state waters. The Harvest Control Rule Framework and Addenda will modify the Council and Commission fishery management plans for all 4 species. This action is being taken because the Commission and the Council's current recreational measures setting process faces several challenges. Recreational fishery data can be very variable from year to year, and there is a lot of uncertainty around the estimates that are provided through the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP for short. Because of how the current management system is set up, changes to recreational measures are needed almost annually because of the highly variable nature of the data. There is also the current perception from the public that measures are not reflective of stock status. For example, measures for black sea bass are being restricted this year despite the fact that black sea bass abundance is very high. Lastly, changes to management measures such as the bag limit, the minimum size, and season have not always had their intended effect on overall harvest. The goal of the Harvest Control Rule is to establish a process for setting recreational measures that prevents overfishing, is reflective of stock status, appropriately accounts for uncertainty in the recreational data, takes into consideration angler preferences, and provides an appropriate level of stability and predictability in changes from year to year. This framework addenda provides 5 possible approaches for setting bag, size, and season limits. The various Harvest Control Rule approaches can be differentiated by the information considered when setting measures. The Harvest Control Rule approaches consider various combinations of the metrics listed on this slide. I'll explain what each of the metrics mean later in the presentation. The Harvest Control Rule approaches also differ by the circumstances under which measures would change. It's important to note here that each option defines a process for establishing measures, and none of the options implement specific measures. The recreational measures would be established and modified through separate future specifications actions. The specifications process is already established in the fishery management plans for all 4 species. To help you understand how the Harvest Control Rule approaches fit into the specifications process, I'll start by providing an overview of how the specifications process works. The specification cycle begins with new stock assessment information with data current through the prior fishing year. These stock assessment reports are typically made available every other year in June. During years when new stock assessment data is not available, the specification cycle begins with the step I will introduce on the next slide. In late June and July, the Scientific and Statistical Committee, the Monitoring Committee, and the Advisory Panel meet to review the stock assessments reports and recreational performance in recent years to recommend catch and landings limits to the Boarding Council. In August, the Commission's Species Management Boards and the Council set the recreational harvest limits for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. In November, the Monitoring Committee and the Advisory Panel meet again to review newly available data from the current year on recreational measure performance, and they make recommendations regarding next year's measures. In December, the Boarding Council approved either a reduction, a liberalization, or status quo measures. They also determine whether to set coastwide measures or state-by-state measures. Lastly, the Commission's Technical Committee, the Species Management Board, and states develop state waters measures. The timing of this may vary under the various harvest control rule options, but typically under our current process, this step takes place during January through March. All 5 of the harvest control rule options listed here on the screen fit into the existing specifications process. I plan to cover each option one by one and introduce the metrics, or in other words, the information that is used in guiding the selection of recreational measures. Option A represents the current recreational measures setting process. The decision to keep the recreational measures the same or change them depends on estimates of recreational harvest compared to the recreational harvest limit in the next year. The recreational measures are reviewed annually under the current process. Many of you may already be familiar with the Marine Recreational Information Program, but for others, MRIP produces harvest estimates which are used to inform both stock assessments and recreational harvest monitoring. With the help of this data, stock assessment scientists and fishery managers are able to determine what is an appropriate level of harvest, and they can generate a recreational harvest limit, or RHL for short. The RHL is measured in pounds of fish. In this hypothetical example, let's say that the harvest limit is 10 million pounds of fish. Anglers then spend a year fishing and catch 10 million pounds of fish. In this example, the RHL was reached, but not exceeded. So this information could be used to inform fishery managers that the recreational measures that were in place this year are appropriate for next year, assuming the 10 million pound RHL remains the same. The no action option of the harvest control rule is not the only option that uses estimated harvest compared to future limits to inform the setting of recreational measures, but it is the only option that relies solely upon the comparison of MRIP harvest to the RHL. The typical current process assumes that the previous year or years of harvest will be the same as next year's harvest if measures stay the same. Using our previous example, let's assume that last year's RHL was 10 million pounds of fish, and that last year 10 million pounds of fish were caught. If the RHL goes up to 15 million pounds next year due to positive stock assessment results, under the current process, measures are relaxed to achieve a 50% increase in expected harvest. For example, the bag limit could increase to allow for more anglers to catch more fish, or the minimum size could be made smaller to allow for more keepers. Conversely, if the RHL goes down to 5 million pounds in the next year due to negative stock assessment results, measures are restricted to reduce expected harvest by 50%. For example, the season could be shortened to prevent the RHL from being exceeded. It's worth mentioning here that although it hasn't been used yet, a modeling approach could also be used to project what harvest will be under the same or future measures to help determine what an appropriate set of measures could be in future years. Next, we have option B, the percent change approach. This approach is informed by recent MRIP harvest estimates compared to recreational harvest limits like the current process, but it is also informed by stock size or biomass relative to the biomass target, a concept which I will explain on the next slide. Unlike option A, option B would set measures for 2 years to align with the release of new stock assessment information. Biomass can be defined as the size of a stock of fish measured in weight. The biomass target is the healthy and sustainable level of a fish stock as determined by a stock assessment. If we are looking at a graph of biomass over time, the biomass target is the dotted line. One of the goals of fisheries management for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish is to keep these stocks at this healthy level. As I said before, harvest control rule option B, the percent change approach, is informed by both estimated harvest compared to future limits and biomass relative to the target. The percent change approach is based off of a table that serves as a decision tree to determine what measures should be made in the coming year. Let's use summer flounder as an example. Based off of recent recreational harvest estimates, we expect that harvest in 2022 will be close to the recreational harvest limit. Next, we consider stock size. We ask ourselves, is the stock size very high, meaning at least 150% of the target stock level, or is the stock size just high, meaning between the target and 150% of the target stock size? Or is the stock size low, below the target stock size? For summer flounder, the 2021 stock assessment indicated that the stock size was below the biomass target, so it can be classified as low. Based on these two metrics, the percent change approach indicates that measures should be restricted to achieve a small 10% reduction in expected harvest to help bring the stock back up towards the target. Black sea bass is a different story. Based on recent years, harvest is expected to be much higher than the 2022 harvest limit, which puts us in row C. But the latest stock assessment tells us that stock size is twice the biomass target, so it is very high. Depending upon the sub-option chosen by the board and council, the appropriate response could either be restricting measures to achieve a small 10% reduction in expected harvest, or no change in measures at all. I'll quickly show you that the full table encompasses all possible combinations of scenarios and the associated outcomes. There are also a few sub-options within the percent change approach. For more details and a comprehensive look at this option, we recommend you view the Harvest Control Rule Addenda document. Next, I'm going to cover the biomass-based matrix approach. You may have noticed that I have started going out of order from how the options are introduced in the addenda. I have done that to introduce options with the fewest metrics first and options that rely on more information last. Option E, the biomass-based matrix approach, is informed by stock size, but also the recent trend in stock size. This approach would also set measures for 2 years to align with the stock assessment schedule. Stock size trend, or biomass trend, is a metric that tells you if biomass is going up, remaining stable, or going down in recent years. The trend can be influenced by any number of factors, but in combination with information on the biomass level relative to its target, biomass trend can help inform what the management response should be. Here we have the biomass-based matrix. When we get new stock assessment information, we look first to stock size in the left column, which can be categorized as very high, high, low, or overfished. Then we look to the biomass trend, which can be classified as increasing, stable, or decreasing. Based on the combination of these two metrics, the matrix shows us which bin our fish stock belongs to, and thus which set of predetermined recreational measures are to be implemented for the upcoming 2 years. Bin 1 represents the best stock conditions and thus the most liberal set of measures, whereas bin 6 represents the overfished condition and would be accompanied by a very restrictive set of measures, which would remain in place until a rebuilding plan was developed. Walking through some examples may help illustrate how this works. Both black sea bass and scup biomass are at least 150% of the target stock size, with a decreasing biomass trend. These two stocks fall into bin 1, which would be accompanied by the most liberal set of measures. Summer flounder biomass, on the other hand, is below the target stock size, but more than 50% of the target with an increasing biomass trend. Summer flounder belongs in bin 3 with a moderate set of measures that would be designed to help the stock grow and reach the target. Lastly, bluefish is below the overfish threshold and has a decreasing biomass trend, which means that bluefish would initially be assigned to bin 6 before the rebuilding plan is put into place. The biological reference point approach is designed similarly to the biomass-based matrix approach, but it is informed by a few additional types of data. The biological reference point approach primarily relies upon biomass and fishing mortality information to assign fish stocks to bins. Additional data, including expected harvest compared to the RHL, recent recruitment, and the biomass trend, are also used to fine-tune measures. A simple definition of fishing mortality is the rate at which fish are caught and are killed from fishing. Fishing mortality is calculated in a stock assessment, and it is used to determine if overfishing is occurring. The fishing mortality threshold is the maximum rate of fishing mortality that the stock can sustain without decreasing below the target sustainable level. When fishing mortality exceeds this rate, overfishing is occurring. Recruitment, another important metric, can be defined as the number of fish born within a year that survive to a certain age. For example, fish that survive to be 1 year old. Continued strong recruitment can lead to a healthy stock in future years. Bad recruitment means that there are less fish to catch in future years. Now that we have gone over all of the different metrics that are used to inform the biological reference point approach, we can walk through a hypothetical example to see how this approach works. Let's say that in 2013, a stock assessment is released that shows that the stock biomass level is very high, or at least 150% of this target stock size, and overfishing is not occurring. This stock would fall into bin 1 with the predetermined measures that are associated with that bin. Then in 2015, the new stock assessment shows that biomass is still very high and overfishing is still not occurring. Since this is the second assessment cycle that the stock is in bin 1, we look to the biomass trend and recruitment, the secondary metrics, to determine if the measures should be liberalized further. Since the biomass trend is increasing, the recreational measures are able to be liberalized. Then, the 2017 stock assessment information is made available, and although the biomass is still very high, we see that the stock is experiencing fishing mortality greater than the thresholds. In other words, overfishing is occurring. This stock would then be assigned to bin 4 with the new set of more restrictive measures to help reduce fishing mortality. Then the 2019 stock assessment is released and biomass is still very high, but overfishing is still occurring. Since this is the second cycle that the stock has been assigned to bin 4, we look at recreational harvest compared to the recreational harvest limit to determine if additional action should be taken. Because recent harvest limits have been exceeded, the stock is assigned a slightly more restrictive set of measures, and measures assigned to all bins are reevaluated. In this way, this approach demonstrates its ability to be reactive to different types of stock assessment information and has accountability measures built into the approach that are responsive to overfishing. The fishery score approach is the last harvest control rule option that I'll present on today. This option relies on 4 different sources of information, including comparing the recent MRIP harvest to the future recreational harvest limits, stock size, fishing mortality, and recent recruitment. Each of these metrics is weighted depending on importance to stock health and is combined into one fishery score. This approach also would set measures every 2 years to align with new stock assessment information. This table displays how the scores translate to stock status and fishery performance outlook, and the assignment of a predetermined set of measures. High scores are reflective of good stock status with a maximum score of 5, and conversely, low scores indicate poor stock status with a minimum score of 1. Using an example weighting scheme for demonstrative purposes, we calculated the fishery scores for each fish stock. Black sea bass has a very good fishery score and would be assigned the most liberal set of measures to reflect that good condition. Summer flounder and scup received a moderate score and would be assigned slightly more restrictive measures, but still liberal measures. Bluefish, largely because of its overfished condition, is designated as having a very poor stock status and fishery performance outlook, and would receive the most restrictive set of measures before the rebuilding plan comes into place. Now that we have introduced all 5 different options, these next few slides compare the options to help you get a sense for how they are different from each other. All options except the no action option would assess the recreational measures every 2 years to determine if adjustments are needed to align with the stock assessment schedule. Under no action, this specifications process would continue to occur every year. The fishery score, biological reference point, and biomass-based matrix approaches all have predetermined sets of measures that are assigned to each bin. The no action and the percent change option don't have bins with predetermined set of measures. This slide tries to demonstrate how the different harvest control rule approaches respond to changes in stock conditions. The biological reference point approach has more bins compared to the biomass-based matrix approach. So that approach is likely to be more responsive with more frequent small adjustments to the measures. The biomass-based matrix has less bins, and so a stock may stay in one bin for longer, but moving to the next bin will have a greater change in measures compared to the biological reference point approach. The no action and the percent change approaches are more responsive to MRIP estimates and don't have bins with predetermined measures, so their change in measures are more in line with the magnitude of an RHL overage, meaning potentially small or large changes from one evaluation to the next. This table is important because it compares the key differences across the 5 options. The columns with the blue shading indicate which information drives the selection of the management measures or drives the determination of the relevant bin, depending on the option. Darker shading indicates a greater impact on measures, and lighter shading indicates a lesser impact on measures. This can help you think about which option you might prefer based on which types of information you think is most important in guiding the selection of measures. However, this is not the only relevant information to consider, because the options also have differences in how responsive they are to changing conditions. For example, if you think all 4 information sources highlighted under the fishery score are important, you might be inclined to support that one. But you'll note that option only has 4 sets of preset measures, as indicated in the last column. Therefore, measures could change less frequently, but the changes would be more drastic when they are required compared to a different option, like the biological reference point option, which primarily focuses on only 2 information sources, but would be more responsive to changing conditions as it has 13 sets of measures. This means measures could change more frequently, but the changes could be smaller. So it's important to think about those trade-offs and what is most important to you when thinking about which option or options you prefer. Now that we have covered the 5 harvest control rule options, I will briefly introduce a few different additional management options within the draft addenda. The technical staff will need to have a target metric when developing measures for each bin with the selected harvest control rule approach. The fishery score approach, the biological reference point approach, and biomass-based matrix approach all use bins with predefined measures. If one of these approaches is selected, the board and council will need to specify whether the measures in each bin will aim to achieve a target level of recreational harvest, or option 3.2a, recreational dead catch, which means harvest plus discarded fish that are presumed to die, which is option 3.2b, or fishing mortality, a measure of the rate of removal from the stock, which is option 3.2c. The next set of options revolve around the Commission's conservation equivalency options. Section 3.3 of the draft addenda includes options to define the degree of flexibility states have in proposing alternative measures through the Commission's conservation equivalency process. Option 3.3a allows individual states to propose alternative measures if they can demonstrate that they are expected to have the same impact on the stock as the measures which would otherwise be implemented. Option 3.3b allows states to work together as regions to propose alternative measures which are expected to have the same impact on the stock as the measures which would be otherwise implemented. Option 3.3c does not allow states or regions to propose alternative measures. It is important to note here that states and regions are able to provide input during the specifications process under all harvest control rule options. The conservation equivalency process is specifically designed for states or regions who later decide that they would like to adjust their measures from what is proposed through specifications. This graph tries to display the trade-offs between flexibility and uncertainty with these conservation equivalency options. Option 3.3a provides the greatest flexibility for states to adjust their management measures after the specifications process is complete, but it increases uncertainty and lowers the level of confidence in being able to model and predict whether the new recreational measures will achieve the target level of harvest, catch, or fishing mortality. Option 3.3c doesn't allow states or regions to use the conservation equivalency process, meaning less flexibility, but technical staff will have the greatest level of confidence in modeling the level of harvest or discards or fishing mortality achieved by the recreational measures and the impact that has on the stock. Option 3.3b allows regions to utilize the conservation equivalency process and represents a middle ground in uncertainty and flexibility between the other two options. Lastly, I'll briefly discuss the accountability measure options within the draft addenda. As a reminder, accountability measures aim to prevent catch limit overages and correct or mitigate for overages when they do occur. Accountability measures are a required component of the federal management program. When catch limits have been exceeded, all options in the addenda require reevaluation of measures to prevent future overages. Some sub-options, however, consider if the response to an overage should be driven by whether or not the overage resulted in overfishing. The details on the accountability measures are laid out in the draft addenda, so we recommend that you review that document for a comprehensive description. Comments on this action may be submitted at hearings or through the following options. You may send an email to comments@asmfc.org with the subject line of Harvest Control Rule. Or you may also mail comments to the address provided on the screen. Please submit your written comments no later than midnight on Friday, April 22nd, 2022. Comments received before this date will be summarized and presented to the board and council in June, where final action is expected. Thank you. This concludes my presentation, and we appreciate your time and engagement with this process.